Final Fantasy 16 is basically here. At the time of me recording this, the demo is out now and the full game is less than a week away. And with all the excitement surrounding the game from both veterans of the series and newcomers alike, many people are out there asking the question, which Final Fantasy should I start with? Today in this video, I'm going to do my best to help you answer that question and give you a handful of good entry points into the series and help you find the first Final Fantasy game that is best for you. So without further ado, let's talk about Final Fantasy. Before we start and I give you my recommendations of where you might want to start in the series, I first want to tackle a handful of questions that I see online, whether it be in comment sections, Discord groups, or even in the real world when people ask me this question. This is something I get very often, and that is, are the games connected? And or do I need to play 15 Final Fantasy games in order to understand Final Fantasy 16? And the answer to both of those questions is no, absolutely not. Final Fantasy is an anthology series. None of the mainline numbered titles are connected to one another in any way. Each numbered title in the series has a completely distinct world and characters from other numbered titles in the series. The only major exceptions to this rule are pretty obvious, and that's if the number has a part 2 at the end of it or has a subtitle. For instance, Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy X Part 2, or the Lightning Trilogy, the Final Fantasy 13 Trilogy, which is Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 13-2, and Final Fantasy Lightning Returns, or if it's something like the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, where it's Final Fantasy VII, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VII Remake. Those games are obviously all connected to each other, but no, you don't need to play 8 in order to understand 9, you don't need to play 3 in order to understand 4, and you don't need to play the first Final Fantasy or any of the other games in order to understand Final Fantasy 16. And if you are a newcomer to the series, and for the purposes of this video, you might be asking, what is Final Fantasy? And I think that this is a fair question to ask, because in many cases, depending on the game, depending on the person who you ask, you're gonna probably get a different answer. Overall, Final Fantasy is a video game series that started in Japan that over time has continued to evolve its formula with its gameplay and story while retaining many of the core elements that the series is known for, like chocobos, moogles, crystals, airships, summons, etc. I know that little description might be an oversimplification to the series, especially if you have played the Final Fantasy games, but really, it's hard to pinpoint what Final Fantasy is nowadays since every game is just so different from one another. I highly recommend watching the video, What is the Spirit of Final Fantasy by Resonant Arc. I will leave that video in the description below if you want to watch that video. They do a much better job than I could ever do at explaining what the heart of a Final Fantasy game is. So with those questions out of the way, there's really only one other point that I want to make before jumping into this list proper, and that is that I am not going to be talking about every Final Fantasy game in this video. Today, I'm only talking about the Final Fantasy video games that I think make an excellent entry point for someone who's never played any game in the series before, which also means I'm probably not going to be talking about my personal favorite games in the series. For instance, Final Fantasy IX is my favorite game in the series. However, I don't recommend that a newcomer to the series start with Final Fantasy IX. And I'm not saying that you can't have a great time if you start with Final Fantasy IX. You can definitely still enjoy that game for what it is. It's just that Final Fantasy IX specifically pays so much homage to previous games in the series that you might be missing out on some enjoyment factor if you don't play other games before 9. So even though I do love that game and I do recommend that everyone eventually play Final Fantasy IX, I also recommend that you maybe play a few of the games on this list before you hop into that game. Anyways, guys, I'm going to present these entry points in numerical order. So without further ado, let's kick this list off with Final Fantasy I. It almost kind of feels like a no-brainer, right? You start the series where the series starts, at the very beginning. I'll just say that starting your Final Fantasy journey with the the very first Final Fantasy game will make sense if you are one of two people. One, you're already committed that you're going to start this series and you're going to play every game in the series and you want to move through them in numerical order. Or two, you're just someone who loves diving into the history of video games and you just have that desire to see where the series started at its roots. I think that starting with Final Fantasy 1 and moving through the series from there will build a certain appreciation for the series that not a ton of fans have. You get to see how the franchise started and from there see every change and aspect of the series be further and further built upon with each next title. However, if you are a story-first kind of gamer or even a gameplay-first kind of gamer, I think that you're going to be kind of disappointed with what the very first Final Fantasy has to offer. In both the gameplay and story department, this is as bare bones as you can get with a turn-based RPG. But when the game came out, you weren't hearing many people say that, because when this game came out, it was revolutionary. No one had played a game like this other than maybe Dragon Quest. But today, we live in a world where there's 16 of the mainline games and tons of spin-offs, so it's totally understandable if you would like your first experience to be something that has a bit more punch than the first game. I also think it's just not a great representation of what the series has turned into today. If you were to start with 1 and then jump straight to something like 7 or 10 or 13, you're probably going to be very shocked that it's all even in the same series. But if starting your Final Fantasy journey with the very first game in the series makes sense to you, I would highly recommend playing the Pixel Remaster version, specifically the console versions if you have a PS4, a PS5, or a Nintendo Switch. If you want more details on Final Fantasy 1 and you want to hear more of my thoughts on it, I'll leave a link right up here so that you can watch my full retrospective and review of Final Fantasy 1. The next game that I would recommend for you to play as your first Final Fantasy is Final Fantasy 4. Final Fantasy 4 is considered by many people to be the very first real Final Fantasy game. A lot of that might be due to the fact that this was actually the second game that America got, but I do think that there might be some more merit to that claim. Final Fantasy IV might not be as refined as some of the future entries, but it does set the standard for storytelling in not only the Final Fantasy franchise, but for video games as a whole. This, I believe, is the best place for you to start if you are a story-first kind of gamer. Memorable characters and soundtrack, plot twists, the story of redemption, emotional highs and lows. This game has all of that and so much more. Now, do I think it does all of that stuff the best in the series? No, not personally, I don't think it does, but I still think that it's a great game, and like I said, it sets the standard for the franchise going forward. The gameplay is your standard turn-based system, but it's also the very first game to include the active time battle system that we will see become the standard for many turn-based RPGs in the future. Now, with the question of which version of Final Fantasy IV do I play, or which is the best version of the game, that question becomes a bit more hard to answer. If you like the art direction of the 2D pixel art, then you can't go wrong with playing the Pixel Remaster. However, if you're starting this game wanting to see the story unfold to its fullest potential, I would recommend maybe checking out the 3D remake on either Steam or Nintendo DS. The 3D remake includes tons of updated dialogue that gives the story direction a lot more depth than the 2D version. It even includes voice acting with a pretty decent performance in my opinion. The story presented in the original 2D version isn't bad by any means. I just wish that when it came to the Pixel remasters that they would have included the updated dialogue from the 3D remake, as I believe that that is the best script of the game. And with all that, there's obviously the decision to make based on your aesthetic opinion. They both have their own unique style that many might prefer one over the other. Personally, I prefer the pixelated versions just if I'm looking at the game itself, but the 3D remake, like I said, has the best script of the game. So personally, I would sacrifice visuals in order for the better story for Final Fantasy IV in that regard, but you might have a completely differing opinion. There's a ton more little details and differences between the 2D and the 3D versions of Final Fantasy IV, but there's just so many, there's way too many to cover in this video alone. I'll just say this: if you're playing Final Fantasy IV for the story alone, play the 3D remake. Otherwise, play the Pixel Remaster. That version is also fantastic. The next game in the series I'll talk about is Final Fantasy V. If you're a newcomer to this series and you just want to jump in and experience firsthand some of the best gameplay that this entire franchise has to offer, Final Fantasy V is easily the best place to start. The game utilizes the job system, which allows you to assign just about any class to any character anytime you want in the game. Final Fantasy III was actually the very first game in the series to use the job system, but it's Final Fantasy V that really cracked the code. If you're a gameplay first kind of person, like I said, Final Fantasy V would be the best place for you to start. The story takes on a bit more of a comedic and silly vibe, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have those emotional moments that many fans remember fondly to this day. It's just that it's the gameplay that takes front and center stage here. You'll almost never have the same playthrough experience as someone else because there's just so many different ways that you can play through this game. For a long time, the general agreement was that the Game Boy Advance version was the best version of the game to play. It had the most updated script for those who wanted to get the most out of its story, and also included a new dungeon and jobs that aren't in any other versions of the game. But now that the Pixel remasters are out, that kind of makes the decision of which version of this game you should play a bit more tough to answer. Even though the GBA version features extra content, the sound quality takes a major hit due to the hardware limitations of the Game Boy. And you'll probably find that playing this version of the game might be a little harder to do for most people nowadays, since the Game Boy Advance just isn't as common of a console to play on, and it's probably going to be pretty tough for you to find a copy for a reasonable price. The Pixel Remaster, on the other hand, is much more available to the public as you can play these games on PC, mobile, PS4, PS5, and Nintendo Switch. Its soundtrack has been fully rearranged and it sounds excellent. Its visuals have been overhauled and it looks beautiful. The script is based off of the Game Boy Advance script, but now has even more little adjustments and tweaks here and there to make it just a bit more better than the Game Boy Advance script, in my opinion. And especially with the console releases, the quality of life additions make the Pixel Remaster way more accessible than any other version of the game. But like I mentioned, the only other thing that the Game Boy Advance has over the Pixel Remasters is those extra jobs and that extra dungeon. So if you're someone who wants to play Final Fantasy V and squeeze as much content out of the game as you possibly can, go for the Game Boy Advance version. It's got that extra stuff in there that you might be interested in checking out. Otherwise, I would highly recommend checking out the Pixel Remaster for the updated music, visuals, and quality of life changes. The next game I'll discuss is Final Fantasy VI. When it comes to the classic 2D pixel art of the Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy VI is almost unanimously agreed to be not only one of the best of the first 6 games, but one of the best games in the entire franchise. Many people even saying it's one of the best games ever made. I love Final Fantasy VI a lot, but it's not my favorite game in the series. However, I do think that it is one of the best starting points in the entire franchise. This game has just about every staple that you can possibly imagine. Chocobos, Moogles, airships, Sid, summons, crystals, comedy, emotional storytelling, unforgettable music, the end of the world, Ultros. This game, like I said, has just about everything that a Final Fantasy fan could possibly want in a Final Fantasy game. I really believe it captures the spirit of what a Final Fantasy game is in a beautiful way. Again, go watch the video that I linked in the description below by Resonant Arc. There's a couple of reasons that I think this might be a perfect starting point for a newcomer. One, if you want to play a retro 2D pixel art Final Fantasy game, Final Fantasy VI is easily the best showcase of what an old school Final Fantasy game has to offer. Two, like I said, this game wraps up everything that is Final Fantasy in one nice package. So if you just want to play one Final Fantasy game that sets the standard going forward and wraps everything up in a nice package like this might be the game for you. And three, if you are a story person. The gameplay here might not be as in-depth as Final Fantasy V, but that doesn't mean that there isn't depth or fun to be had here with the gameplay. There's tons of characters to play as in this game, but they're almost all locked into one specific job or class. A lot of the strategy here comes with deciding who you want in and out of your party and what summons you want equipped to those characters. But the big thing in this game that shines brighter than all of the other previous greatest games here in the series, in my opinion, is its storytelling. With characters you fall in love with and dilemmas that you actually care about, you really can't go wrong starting your Final Fantasy journey with 6. Like most of the games in the series, there are tons of different ways that you can play through Final Fantasy 6, but I recommend that you go with the console version of the Pixel Remaster for pretty much all of the same reasons that I recommend the Pixel Remaster for the previous games. Updated visuals and soundtrack, quality of life changes, etc. My next recommended starting point is Final Fantasy VII. This is arguably the most popular Final Fantasy ever made. Many people out there who don't even play video games could probably see a screenshot or a character model from the game and say something like, yeah, I've seen that before. Since its release, it's been the top-selling Final Fantasy out of any other game in the series. It's also the very first 3D Final Fantasy, being the first game in the series to come to the PS1. It's also the first game in the series to fully step away from medieval fantasy. The gameplay is still turn-based, but now includes the materia system, which adds a layer to the ability and gear customization that becomes very addicting to play around with as you progress through the game. The main thing here that stands out, though, is the characters and the story. Cloud is one of the most memorable characters and has one of the most iconic character designs in all of gaming, and the main antagonist of the story, Sephiroth, is almost just as memorable. There's a ton about this game and its gameplay and its storytelling that I could get into, but I mainly just want to talk about why this might be a really good starting point in the series for you. And honestly, this might sound a little silly, but one of the biggest reasons that I can think of right now is the fact that Square Enix, the company who has developed this game, this is clearly their baby. This is the game out of all of the games in the series that they clearly care the most about. If you played through Final Fantasy VII and you enjoyed it, you're in luck, because there is tons and tons and tons of Final Fantasy VII material out there, whether it be a movie, an anime, prequel video games, sequel video games, and of course, the Final Fantasy VII Remake. The world of Final Fantasy VII isn't going anywhere anytime soon, so you might as well play the original game that kicked off this whole universe of Final Fantasy VII games. Keep in mind though, I am talking about the original Final Fantasy VII. I'm not talking about starting your Final Fantasy journey with the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I love the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but I really don't suggest that you start your 7 journey with the remake. If you're someone who's really interested in playing the Final Fantasy VII Remake, you'll do yourself a ton of favors by playing the original Final Fantasy VII and maybe its sequels and prequels first. That doesn't mean that you can't enjoy Final Fantasy VII Remake if you don't play Final Fantasy VII. That's not what I'm saying. It's just, without getting into spoilers, I think that you'll have a certain appreciation and an understanding of what's happening in Final Fantasy VII Remake if you play the original first. Of course, like usual, there are tons and tons of ways to play through Final Fantasy VII for the first time, but I personally recommend you either playing the Steam port or the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4 port. The Steam port would be the best option for you if you're really into modding. There are tons and tons of mods out there that aim to make Final Fantasy VII the best possible experience that it can be, although if that's not your cup of tea, if you're not into the modding scene or anything like that, and you just want to play Final Fantasy VII as it is, as a complete package, I would definitely suggest just picking up the Nintendo Switch or PS4 port. Up next on the recommendations list is Final Fantasy X. This was the first big generational step in the series since Final Fantasy VII. This was the first Final Fantasy on the PS2 and the first Final Fantasy to feature voice acting. And I'll just get this out of the way now. This might be the closest to a correct answer as far as which Final Fantasy you should start with. It's just such an excellent mixture of old school and new school. It continues the trend of combat being turn-based, but now you can see a turn order, which allows you to take your time and be more strategic with every action that you take. The sphere grid is also introduced here, and it acts as the main form of character progression. You don't level up conventionally, but instead, you get full control over what stats your characters will level up, as well as what abilities are learned. Each character has a certain class that best suits them, but newer releases of Final Fantasy X give you the option to use the Expert Sphere Grid mode from the start. This allows you to decide what class your party characters will be from the moment you start leveling them up. And just like many of the other games here in the series, the story here is pretty deep. You'll fall in love with just about everything that this world has to offer. Final Fantasy games have a strong reputation of creating original worlds in the series that are so positively unique, and Final Fantasy X is no exception. This is the perfect starting point for anybody who wants an engaging story with a deep combat system and wants that blend of old school and new school Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy X has just about as many ports and re-releases as Skyrim. If you wanted to, I'm sure you could play Final Fantasy X on your smart fridge. But I would definitely go ahead and buy the Final Fantasy X and X-2 HD remaster. It's available on pretty much every single modern console out there. The collection gives you Final Fantasy X and its direct sequel, X Part 2. And with all of these leaks and rumors swimming around about a 10 remake and 10 Part 3 potentially happening, now seems as good a time as any to see what Final Fantasy X is all about. My next recommendation would be Final Fantasy XIV Online. I had to include this game in here just because I know that there's an entire crowd of people out there who either A, will never play this game, or B, only play this type of game. Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO RPG. There's only 2 MMOs in the entire mainline series, the other one being Final Fantasy XI, but Final Fantasy XIV is hands down the better one of the 2. This game is very well known for turning casual gamers and casual Final Fantasy fans into MMO RPG players. Many diehard Final Fantasy fans will definitely tell you that Final Fantasy XIV might actually be the best game in the series, and plenty of other people will also say that the game is probably the best MMO of all time, even beating World of Warcraft. The biggest hurdle that this game has, though, is just the fact that it is an MMO RPG. There are just many people out there who won't even bother to touch the game simply based on the principle alone that it's not a single-player Final Fantasy game like the other ones. I personally haven't played anything past the base game into the other expansions, but anybody who has, anyone who is a current player of Final Fantasy XIV will absolutely tell you that Final Fantasy XIV probably has the best narrative out of any game in the entire franchise. Of course, this is subjective. Like I said, this is not something that I can attest to, but you should know that the people who play this game, this is what pretty much all of them claim. If you've played an MMO before, the gameplay might be something that you expect. It isn't turn-based like the other games in the list, but instead you have abilities that recharge after you use them. So as long as an ability is available to use, you can attack freely. You can also take on any jobs or classes that you like. So outside of the job system in Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy XIV might actually take the crown in the series of having the best gameplay customization. Your party members can consist of NPCs in the world, but obviously it's an MMO, and one of the biggest draws to an MMO is playing the game in a party of friends. If you're the kind of person who can sink some time into a really, really fleshed out MMO experience, you're in luck because Final Fantasy XIV offers an incredibly generous free trial. For free, you can basically play through the entire base game, A Realm Reborn, and its first expansion, Heavensward. There's a few limitations that the trial puts in place, like level cap and how many characters that you can make per world, but honestly, this trial is generous enough. It should give you pretty much the answer that you need of whether or not this game is for you. Give it a go if you want to check it out for yourself. It's available on PS4, PS5, and PC. And lastly, since it is the big game everyone's talking about right now, Final Fantasy XVI. As of making this video, Final Fantasy XVI isn't out yet, so I personally can't tell you with confidence whether or not Final Fantasy XVI is a perfect starting point in the series or not. However, the demo that we just got that shows off the entire prologue of the game and a bunch of gameplay snippets from a few hours into the game, all of that seems incredibly promising. Final Fantasy XVI is the first game in the series to be a fully single-player action RPG. If you're a die-hard turn-based fan and you're not a fan of action games like Kingdom Hearts or Devil May Cry, this probably isn't going to be your cup of tea. However, if you're fully on board with playing a fast-paced God of War 2018 inspired action RPG, then you're likely going to have a lot of fun with Final Fantasy XVI. The only negative thing that I can say right now about starting with this game might just be from the fact that it's just the most different gameplay-wise than anything else in the series. If you love the action RPG combat system here and that's what you want to stick with, you just want to keep on playing games like Final Fantasy XVI, you're probably going to be disappointed as you go into the back catalog of the Final Fantasy franchise. But with all of that said, I think Final Fantasy 16 is a prime example of it doesn't really matter where you start. Like I said earlier in this video, the definition of Final Fantasy is just different for different people. It's safe to say that this series has a little bit of something for everyone. So for the tons of people out there who are saying, which Final Fantasy games should I play before Final Fantasy 16? My answer is just to play Final Fantasy 16. Especially with the demo that they released showing off the beginning of the game, you can find out for yourself pretty easily whether or not this game is going to be for you. And if it's not for you, that's totally fine, that's reasonable. There's probably something else here in the series that is for you. I know I gave a lot of options here in this video on where you might want to start in the series, but I personally really do think that the 8 games that I presented here are some of the best entry points into the series, depending on what specifically you might be looking for. Maybe through watching this, you've kind of decided for yourself where you might want to start in the series, but if I were to give you my personal recommendation as a story-first gamer, I personally would start with Final Fantasy IV 3D, whether it be on Steam or Nintendo DS, that's up to you, but I would start with that game, and then from there, move upwards into the series and play just about everything. And then once you feel caught up on whatever is the newest thing or whatever, I would then go back and play Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. But honestly, too, I would just recommend play Final Fantasy 16 first. 1, because it's the newest thing. You should definitely check it out. But 2, it looks great. It plays great. The story seems really, really intriguing from the demo that we have. I think it's just going to be an all-around good experience for people who have either never played the game series or people who are fans. And then if that's what you do, if you start with 16, I would then go back to Final Fantasy IV 3D, and then from there, do the list that I had just said, go through all of the games, and then go back to 1, 2, and 3. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I know that it was kind of a longer one with Final Fantasy 16 releasing. I just wanted to kind of get this discussion video out there. I know that there's tons of newbies to the series who just want to know where to start. So I was just hoping that this video would be helpful to some of y'all out there. Let me know down in the comments below what you think is the best starting point. What was your very first Final Fantasy game? I want to know down in the comments below. And while you're down there, go ahead and hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell as well so that you're notified whenever new videos like these go up on the channel. Also, while you're down there, there's a link to the Discord as well, and I would love to see all of y'all in my Discord server. I love talking to all you guys about video games. Please join the Discord. We want you there. And then over here, you can find a video that I just uploaded where I talked about my entire first impressions and all of my thoughts and feelings on the demo, the prologue, the gameplay to Final Fantasy 16. If any of that is interesting to you, go and watch that video right over there. And with all that said, I will see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.